Uriel isn't being introduced as a new Warframe. He's being introduced as a confession, a living admission that something the Orokin did was so extreme, so morally rotten, that it can't be explained away with beautiful architecture and clean language anymore. And that matters, because Warframe usually tells Orokin history, like a myth. Grand sins, grand consequences, and then the story moves on. Uriel doesn't let it move on. Uriel forces the sin to speak in symbols. He forces you to look at the cost, not just the outcome. The name, the framing, the atmosphere, all of it is Warframe saying, this is not a tool. This is a verdict. Here's the minimal context that matters. Alongside the Tau memory chapter in the old piece, the update introduces the Protoframe thread. Protoframes read like earlier, stranger versions of the Warframe idea, where a human life is still visible inside the shape. Uriel is tied to one of those Protoframes, Roth, a figure framed as a heretic, a person whose story is built around guilt, truth, and the kind of punishment that never really ends. Before we dive in, thank you for watching. It means a lot. If this kind of lore breakdown is your thing, a like and a sub helps me a ton and keeps these videos coming. And let me know in the comments what other games or series you want me to cover next. I'm always looking for good worlds to dig into. Now, Roth is where the confession becomes real, because Roth doesn't feel like someone who pilots Uriel. He feels like someone sentenced to wear Uriel. He carries himself like a man who has been trapped inside the consequences of his own choices for so long that he no longer knows whether he wants redemption or punishment more. That's the first big point. Uriel is a Warframe-shaped expression of moral weight. The Orokin had a talent for turning atrocities into sterile procedures. They called cruelty science. They called control order. They took living beings, broke them, reshaped them, and then acted like the results were simply progress. Rotha reads like an Orokin who can no longer hide behind that language. He has seen the truth long enough that the rationalizations stopped working. And that's exactly what a confession is. It's the moment the story you told yourself collapses. The Heretic of Zata label matters because heresy is never just being wrong. Heresy is refusing the approved version of reality. In the Orokin era, reality is curated. History is curated. Even identity is curated. If Roth is a heretic, that means he broke with the official truth. Either he learned something he wasn't supposed to learn, or he refused to keep pretending, or he tried to expose what the Orokin were doing and paid for it. And in an empire like that, the punishment isn't always death. Death is too clean. Death ends the story. Sometimes the punishment is to become a symbol, a warning, a living sermon. That's where Uriel's devil framing becomes more than aesthetics. Devils, in myth, aren't just monsters. They are accusations given form. They reveal hypocrisy. They punish the lie people tell themselves about being righteous. Uriel feels like that kind of figure. A cathedral-level horror that looks built to force a certain feeling in anyone who sees it. Awe, fear, and the uncomfortable sense that somebody is being judged. Uriel drags the setting into a more gothic register on purpose. It's the story changing its vocabulary. When Warframe starts talking in cathedral imagery, it's usually because the question isn't who wins. The question is who deserves forgiveness. And that question is poison to the Orokin, because the Orokin built their power by acting like forgiveness was irrelevant. As long as they were in control, morality was just decoration. Uriel is the update's way of ripping that decoration off. There's also a mirror here that makes Roth even more compelling. The Tenno is a child made into a weapon and then, slowly, forced to reclaim agency. Roth is an adult shaped by the Empire, who now seems trapped inside a body that won't let him forget complicity. One story is about waking up from control. The other is about being haunted by what you did while you were controlled, or while you benefited from the control system, or while you told yourself you had no choice. So when Uriel shows up, the story isn't just adding a new character, it's adding a new kind of guilt. The Tenno's guilt tends to be about what they were used for. Roth's guilt is about what he was part of. And that's why Uriel isn't just a Warframe. He's a confession, a body that says, we did this even if the Orokin are long dead and the archives have been rewritten. Because some sins don't stay buried, they learn how to walk. Once you accept Uriel as a confession, the next question becomes obvious. What exactly is being confessed? Not a single incident, not one unfortunate experiment, something broader, a pattern, a way of living, a way of justifying cruelty until the justification becomes the culture. Because the Orokin didn't just commit crimes, they normalized them. They built an entire aesthetic around being untouchable. Clean halls, perfect symmetry, beautiful words. And behind that beauty, they treated people as materials. They treated identity as something you could edit, break, and reassign like a file. Uriel reads like the moment that system starts to admit what it really is. That's why Roth being framed as a heretic is so effective. A heretic isn't valuable to a regime because he's wrong. He's valuable because he proves the regime can be questioned. He proves the official truth is not absolute. And once that proof exists, the regime has to react. Not merely to silence him, but to transform him into something that reinforces obedience. This is where the devil, archetype, becomes functional. A devil is a public tool. A devil is a story told with teeth. A devil is a warning sign the size of a cathedral. If you want to end dissent, you don't only kill the dissenter, you make an example out of him so powerful that everyone else polices themselves. Uriel feels like that kind of example, a being designed to inspire the feeling, do not stray, do not question, do not look behind the curtains. But here's the twist that makes it a confession instead of a simple punishment. Uriel doesn't only frighten outsiders, he also indicts the people who made him. Because if you can look at Uriel and feel horror, you have to admit that somebody chose to create that horror. Somebody considered it acceptable. Somebody decided the line didn't exist or didn't matter. So the confession isn't only Roth saying, I did wrong. It's the setting saying, this is what the Orokin thought was normal. That is why the Protoframe concept hits harder than the usual Warframe tragedy. The classic Warframe tragedy is transformation. A person is turned into a weapon. The Protoframe tragedy feels closer to imprisonment. The person inside is still present enough to carry shame, to remember, to speak, to suffer in a way that doesn't get dulled by time. Roth, bound to Uriel, becomes a living record of a moral catastrophe, not a data log, not a museum plaque, a person. And in Warframe, a person is always more dangerous than a record. Records can be edited, people can refuse. This is also why Uriel's story sits so naturally beside the Old Peace chapter. The Old Peace is about a truth that was buried because it threatened the official narrative. Uriel is about a truth that refuses burial. Uriel is the guilt that crawls out from under the architecture and stands in the cathedral aisle where everyone can see it. That connection matters because it suggests the update is doing something very deliberate. It is linking the politics of war to the spirituality of consequence. The Old Peace asks, who killed the future? Uriel asks, who pays for it? Now, the underworld framing tied to Roeth's mind space is the strongest expression of this. The dissent motif isn't just there for drama. Dissent is what you do when you're dealing with confession. Confession requires digging. It requires stripping away the protective story you tell yourself until all that remains is what you actually did and what you actually believe. And that's why the environment feels like a personal inferno. It isn't a random hell. It's a structured hell. Layers, floors, chambers, the architecture of a conscience. You descend through the parts of Roth that he can't escape. Each step deeper is the story saying, the truth is down here. You don't get to reach it by staying clean. That's a very different tone from most Warframe quests, and that difference is the point. Warframe is moving from pure sci-fi tragedy into a kind of gothic moral horror. A horror where the monster isn't just a creature. The monster is a civilization that believed it could do anything and never answer for it. Uriel is that answer taking form. There's also a more personal reading of the confession, and it's what makes Roth feel distinct from other Orokin figures. Most Orokin characters we meet are shameless. They speak like gods. They move like they've never doubted themselves for a second. Roth feels like an Orokin who has started to doubt, and doubt is the beginning of collapse. If you're someone who benefited from an evil system, doubt is painful in a specific way. It doesn't just say, the system is wrong. It says, I was wrong while I smiled. It says, I profited while pretending it was necessary. It says, I might have called it order because I didn't want to call it cruelty. That kind of doubt doesn't create clean redemption arcs. It creates confessions, and confessions in Warframe aren't performed to be forgiven. They're performed because the truth is starting to burn. So Uriel is not just a Warframe, it's the moment the lie stops being comfortable. It's the moment the setting stops letting the Orokin aesthetic do the moral work. It's Warframe holding up a mirror and saying, "Look at what you made! Look at what you allowed!" And once that mirror is in the story, it starts reflecting onto everything else. Onto the Tenno, onto the old war, onto the old peace, onto the idea of whether anyone in this universe can ever be clean again. There's a reason this confession is wrapped in religious language instead of scientific language. Science can make cruelty sound neutral. Religion can't. Religion makes cruelty sound like sin. It forces a moral vocabulary into the room. And once moral vocabulary arrives, the Orokin's usual defense collapses. They can't hide behind procedure when the story is calling it heresy, devil, and absolution. That's why Roeth's arc feels like a trial, even when nobody is holding a gavel. The audience becomes the jury. The dissent becomes testimony. Uriel becomes Exhibit A. And a confession always has two audiences: the world and the self. Roeth's self-audience is what gives the story its weight. If he were simply an Orokin villain, there would be no confession. There would be a manifesto. Confession implies shame. It implies a point where the person inside the system finally sees themselves from the outside and can't unsee it. That shame doesn't necessarily mean Roeth is good. Shame doesn't absolve anyone. Shame is only proof that the mask cracked. But in a setting where the Orokin are defined by masks, the crack matters. It is the first time an Orokin-flavored character feels like he's living with the consequences rather than floating above them. Uriel is the body of that consequence. This also helps explain why Uriel's presence is so visually theatrical. The Orokin loved theater. They loved rituals. They loved spectacle. If they were going to punish a heretic, they wouldn't do it quietly. They would do it in a way that reinforces the myth of Orokin authority. They would turn punishment into performance. But performance can backfire. A performance meant to scare people can also reveal the truth behind the curtain. A devil meant to enforce obedience can also expose what kind of civilization needs devils to function. So even if Uriel began as an instrument of control, he becomes an instrument of indictment. Because every time you see him, you are forced to confront the same question. What kind of empire builds a devil and still calls itself righteous? That question lands especially hard in Warframe, because the Orokin didn't only build devils, they built saints too. They built narratives where they were the keepers of order, and everyone else was chaos. They built a hierarchy where beauty was treated as morality. If something looked perfect, it was allowed. If something looked ugly, it was condemned. Uriel flips that logic. He is ugly in the ways that matter, but honest. He doesn't pretend. He doesn't soften the edges. He announces the horror instead of disguising it. And that's why confession is the right word. Confession isn't clean. Confession doesn't come with pretty packaging. Confession is the moment the truth forces itself out without caring whether it ruins the story you wanted to keep telling. There's also a subtle way this ties back into the Tenno. The Tenno's arc has always involved rediscovering identity through suppressed memories. That's the core of Warframe's storytelling. You wake up, you fight, you learn the truth, you realize you were shaped by lies, and then you try to become something more than what you were designed to be. Uriel and Roeth feel like the Orokin version of that, twisted and older. Not a child weapon waking up, but an adult participant waking up to what participation meant. The Tenno's grief is, what did they do to me? Roeth's grief is, what did I allow to be done to others? So the confession doesn't just deepen Uriel, it deepens the whole setting. It draws a line between being a victim of the system and being complicit in it. Warframe usually gives us victims. The infested, the Warframes, the Tenno. Roth introduces a rarer kind of story. A story about someone who was inside the Empire's comfort and then became unable to live with the comfort. That's why Roth's heresy matters. Heresy is not always noble. Sometimes heresy is simply honesty arriving too late. Sometimes it's guilt looking for a language that can contain it. And the story gives Roeth that language through the devil motif. Devils are what you create when you need to externalize evil, when you need to point at something and say, that is the monster, so nobody asks whether the monster was built by your own hands. Uriel breaks that trick. Uriel is the monster, but he's also the receipt. So the episode title holds. Uriel is not just a Warframe. Not because he has lore attached, every Warframe does, but because his lore functions differently. It doesn't exist to justify powers or explain a kit. It exists to force the setting to admit what it did, and to force a specific character to live inside that admission. And once the setting starts admitting, it becomes harder to contain what else might come spilling out. Not only about Roth, but about the entire chain of sins that led to Tau, to the old peace, to betrayal, to memory suppression, and to the present era, where the Tenno is still digging through sealed rooms trying to find out which parts of their life were real. Uriel is a confession because it refuses to let history remain tidy. It insists that the past is not finished simply because the Empire is gone. The past is still alive, walking around, wearing armor, and demanding to be seen for what it is. And that demand changes the mood of everything that follows. There's another layer to why this works, and it's the way Warframe uses bodies as storytelling. In this universe, bodies are never neutral. Bodies are archives. Bodies are prisons. Bodies are propaganda. When the Orokin wanted to control someone, they didn't just give orders. They changed the person's body. They turned identity into hardware. So when Uriel arrives, the body is the message. The body says, here is what an Orokin truth looks like when it can't be polished. It says, here is what remains when you remove the euphemisms. Uriel's form is not sleek, because sleekness is how the Orokin lie to themselves. Uriel is heavy, because weight is how guilt shows itself in a world that refuses to speak plainly. That's why the Protoframe angle matters so much. Protoframes, by design, feel closer to the human inside. Not necessarily in a warm, comforting way. In a claustrophobic way, they carry voice, presence, and personality more directly. They are not purely a suit. They are a merger that didn't fully erase the person. And if the person inside is an Orokin heretic, that's a fascinating kind of horror, because it means the confession isn't written in ink. It's written in a living nervous system. The kind of confession you can't burn, because it breathes. This is also why absolution becomes a recurring theme around this thread. Absolution is not forgiveness in the cheap sense. Absolution is the removal of guilt, or at least the belief that the guilt has been accounted for. It's what people seek when they can't undo what they've done, but also can't live under the weight of it forever. In Warframe, very few characters ever get absolution. They get consequences, they get revenge, they get survival. But absolution is rare because absolution requires a world where moral repair is possible. A world where someone can say, yes, that was wrong, and then take real steps to make amends. The Orokin never did that. The Orokin's version of absolution was rewriting the record and calling the rewrite truth. Uriel's confession is the opposite of that. It's the record refusing to be rewritten, and that's why the story keeps leaning on cathedral imagery. Cathedrals are built for two things: reverence and confession. They are spaces designed to make humans feel small in the face of something larger. In Warframe's case, that something larger isn't necessarily a god. It's the weight of what the Orokin did to the system. The cathedral becomes the stage where the Empire's sins are finally treated like sins instead of strategy. Now bring this back to Roth as a person. If Roth is truly seeking something like absolution, it changes how you read his heresy. Heresy becomes not just rebellion against authority, but rebellion against self-deception. It becomes the refusal to keep calling evil necessary. It becomes the refusal to keep using beautiful words to hide ugly acts. That's powerful, but it's also dangerous because confession is contagious. When one person admits the truth, it becomes easier for others to admit it too. That's why authoritarian systems fear confession. Not because it's morally bad, but because it breaks the spell. So Uriel, as confession, becomes a destabilizing artifact, a symbol that can't be comfortably absorbed into the Empire's old myth. And that explains why he feels like he belongs in a hidden chapter of Warframe rather than the mainline Warriors catalogue. He's too morally loud to be treated like ordinary content. There's also a thematic symmetry here with the old peace itself. The old peace is a suppressed memory of an alternative path. Uriel is a suppressed guilt of the path that was chosen. One is about what could have been. The other is about what was done instead. Together, they create a shape that feels intentional. The update is telling you, you are going to learn about the lies we told, and you are also going to meet the consequences of the lies we lived. That's why Roth's internal underworld is so important. Underworlds in stories aren't just spooky settings. They're places where you confront what you buried. They're where you meet the parts of yourself you can't outrun. And if Roathi's underworld is structured like layers, it suggests his guilt is layered too. Not one sin, a ladder of sins, a pattern repeated until it became identity. Uriel then becomes the embodiment of that ladder, a confession that isn't, I made one mistake. A confession that is, I lived inside a system of mistakes and I helped call it normal. And this is where the title lands even harder, because it warns you not to treat Uriel as a neutral object. If you treat him like a new suit, you miss the point. The point is that Uriel is Warframe starting to talk about moral rot, with a seriousness it usually reserves for cosmic horror. Because moral rot is a kind of cosmic horror in this universe. The Orokin created horrors and then acted like they were above horror. Uriel is the story saying, no, you were never above it. You were inside it. So when you encounter Uriel and Roth, you're not just getting lore, you're getting a new kind of lens. A lens that makes everything else look sharper. It makes the old war look less like a fate and more like a choice. It makes the old peace look less like an accident and more like an opportunity that was murdered. And it makes the present era feel less like the aftermath of history and more like history still bleeding through the walls. That's what confessions do. They don't end anything. They open the door to everything you avoided saying. And because it's a body, the guilt becomes personal. It stops being the Orokin did bad things and becomes someone chose this. Someone signed off. Someone looked at a human life and decided it was acceptable material. Someone decided fear would be more useful than mercy. Someone decided a devil would be an effective tool. Roth is the story's way of making that someone feel real, not to absolve him, to make the confession meaningful. A confession without a confessor is just a lesson. A confession with a confessor is a wound being opened. And once the wound is open, Warframe can do something it hasn't done often enough with the Orokin. It can explore consequence without turning it into spectacle. Not, look how cool the monster is, but look at what the monster proves about the hands that made it. That's the entire point of the title. If Uriel were just a Warframe, then his existence would be neutral. He'd be a new suit with a theme, but the update is clearly treating him as a narrative object with moral gravity. Uriel is the setting admitting, in the loudest language it has, that the Orokin era produced horrors that were not accidental side effects. They were intended outcomes of a culture that believed it was entitled to reshape life. In that sense, Uriel doesn't only confess the crime, he confesses the mindset. The idea that power equals permission, the idea that beauty erases brutality, the idea that if you can do something, you should, and anyone harmed by it is simply a necessary cost. Uriel rejects that mindset by existing as its consequence, a walking contradiction, a creature born from order that looks like damnation. And that's why he sits so naturally beside the Protoframe thread. Protoframes feel like the story's attempt to bring personhood back into focus, to remind you that inside every Warframe-shaped horror, there was once someone who could have had a normal life, someone who laughed, someone who feared, someone who wanted something simple. Protoframes make that harder to ignore. So when Uriel shows up in that context, the confession becomes clearer. It's not only we made monsters, it's we made monsters out of people. That's the sentence Warframe rarely says plainly, but it's what the entire Orokin tragedy is built on. And now, because the confession has been spoken, the story becomes harder to contain. Once you admit that the sins were intentional, you can't keep telling the old story where the Orokin were tragic geniuses who just made a few mistakes. You have to accept that the Empire's fall was not just bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of a civilization that treated life as clay. Uriel is the moment that inevitability becomes visible, not as a history lesson, as a presence. So the title stays true. Uriel isn't just a Warframe. He's a confession, and not a comfortable one. It's the kind of confession that doesn't ask to be forgiven. It forces you to look. And once you've looked, you can't go back to the old, clean version of the old war. Not the clean version of the Orokin, not the clean version of what progress meant. Because the confession did its job. It broke the spell of beautiful lies. That's what a devil is for in a story like this. Not to tempt you into evil, but to reveal that evil was already there, wearing gold, calling itself righteous, and building cathedrals to hide the blood. And Uriel, in the middle of all that, stands like a monument that says one thing without flinching. We did this.